This is the third in a series of videos that explores why translation is so difficult. If you have not already watched and understood the second video in the series, please stop and watch it before watching this one. In the second video, we explored some of the factors that go into how we attribute meaning to the messages we receive from other humans. In particular, we looked at how we rely on what we call the interpretive context of the message to narrow down what the message might mean. The facets of the context that we considered were the situation in which the message comes to us, the relationship between the people involved in the situation, the culture we are part of, and our worldview. To illustrate how these elements shape our understanding of a message, we considered how we might understand the cries of a baby sitting in a high chair. Taking the situation into account, we might interpret the cries as a demand for food. If we have a relationship with the child, we might believe she is asking for her new toy. In middle-class American culture, the cry might be a sign that the child needs a diaper change. And if our worldview included a feature common to many traditional cultures around the world, we might interpret the child's cries as a sign that our ancestors wanted our attention. We also said that the process of attributing any of these meanings to the child's cries is called inference. We attribute meaning to her attempts at communication based on the four facets of the interpretive context, and we will go on to suggest that a similar process is in play whenever we attribute meaning to any message we encounter. At this point, you might be thinking, hold on, all this about needing to infer what someone means might be true when a baby is crying. But it is completely unnecessary when human language is involved, because human language carries meaning in its own right. Doesn't using language to communicate eliminate the need to infer what someone means? To help us think about this, let's consider the sentence, "The key is in the trunk." What does it mean? Or let's start with an even simpler question. What does the word key mean in this sentence? The first thing that comes to mind might be a key to a lock, but it is also possible that it refers to a key on a computer keyboard, or a piano key, or even an answer key to a test. Similarly, the trunk in question may refer to a big chest, or the trunk of a car, or of a tree, or even an elephant's nose. To choose from among the many possible meanings evoked by this sentence, people rely on the context in which they encounter it. For example, if there is a car with an open trunk lid in the immediate vicinity, it would be quite natural to infer that the word trunk in the sentence referred to the trunk of a car. And since certain types of keys are associated with cars, it is also natural to infer that the word key in this instance refers to a car key. If, on the other hand, one is in a room with a large chest sitting prominently on the floor, it would be more natural to infer that the speaker is talking about that chest than about the back of a car. It would also be quite natural to think that the key referred to the key to the trunk. However, if there were also a piano with a missing key sitting next to the trunk, this added information might lead one to infer that the key in question was in fact the key that was missing from the piano. And what if there is an elephant in the room? Identifying trunk with the elephant's nose would be pretty straightforward. But what about key? What might that refer to? Let's think now about another aspect of the situations in which one is likely to encounter the sentence, "The key is in the trunk." It is very likely to occur in the context of other words and sentences. For example, if it is in response to the question, "Why are you standing in the driveway?" to what are key and trunk likely to refer? What if it's a response to, "How am I going to pass that test?" What about, "How can you tell if an elephant is sick?" In this case, the trunk probably means the elephant's nose, but key here refers to an intangible principle, yet another meaning to add to the list of possibilities. Now that we've considered these examples, let's return to the question we asked a few minutes ago. Doesn't using language to communicate eliminate the need to infer what someone means? So far, we've seen that the simple sentence, "The key is in the trunk," though it's in a language we understand perfectly well, is actually quite ambiguous. That ambiguity was mostly resolved, however, when the sentence occurred in particular places and in the presence of particular objects. Does this relate to anything we said previously about the interpretive context? In this instance, which facet of the interpretive context is most helpful in inferring the correct meaning? Remember in the last video, we said we would define the situation as the physical surroundings of the message combined with the events immediately preceding it. In this case, the clues that helped us attribute the correct meaning to the sentence were part of the physical surroundings. In these examples, then, the most relevant facet of the interpretive context was the situation. We also considered 3 instances where the information needed to attribute the intended meaning to the message came from questions asked just prior to its production. Can these questions be considered part of the interpretive context as well? Which part? Once again, they are part of the situation. Remember, the situation also includes events that immediately precede the production of the message. Asking a question counts as just such an event. Even though we rely on the interpretive context to infer the meaning both of a baby's cry and of a sentence in natural language, there are, of course, significant differences between the 2 kinds of messages. Note first that, if the message is in a language you do not understand, you would be less likely to infer the intended meaning of that message than you would the meaning of the baby's cry. If, on the other hand, the message is in a language you do understand, you are far more likely to infer the meaning that the speaker intended, and the information you would infer would be far more certain and precise. Part of the reason that this is so is that the use of words in a language we know excludes from our consideration the vast majority of incorrect inferences. Take, for example, the word key. Even though the word has a fair number of possible meanings, there are many, many more meanings that the speaker does not intend you to infer. And since, in English, these meanings are not associated with the word key, under normal circumstances you will not bother to consider them when the word key is used. The degree to which using language to communicate will be successful depends on the degree to which the recipient of the message understands the language that the initiator of the message is using. This is similar to what we said earlier about the recipient's knowledge of the situation, relationship with the person sending the message, and understanding of culture and worldview. Language, then, is the 5th facet of the interpretive context. So far in our discussion, we've been focusing on how people infer the meaning of the messages they get from others, but we haven't much considered whether or not those inferences are in fact the meaning that the sender of the message intended. Assuming that the sender wants the recipient to correctly understand his intended meaning, how can he make sure that happens? He will do so by adjusting the message to fit what he believes is the state of the recipient's interpretive context. For example, suppose you are standing in a living room next to a big wooden chest and a piano with a broken key, and I come in and say, "The key is in the trunk." What will you think I mean? Well, if this is the first mention of key and trunk that had passed between us all day, you would be likely to take your cues from the immediate situation and infer that I was talking about the location of the piano key. If, on the other hand, we had just been talking about an answer key that I could not find, and you knew that I had just gone into the garage to look for it in the Honda, you would probably infer that I was referring to the answer key and the trunk of the Honda. But what if I came in from the garage and we had not been discussing the location of the missing answer key, and I still wanted to make sure you knew which key and which trunk I meant? In that case, I would be likely to modify my message so that, given the information I thought you already knew, plus the information I supplied, you would infer the meaning that I intended. Instead of simply saying, "The key is in the trunk," I might say, "I found the answer key that I've been looking for in the trunk of the Honda." In the same way, then, that the recipient of a message infers what the sender means based on the recipient's understanding of the interpretive context, the sender formulates his message based on what he believes the state of the recipient's interpretive context to be. The degree to which communication is successful depends in large part on both the sender and the recipient guessing correctly what the other is thinking. This point is important, so we'll belabor it a bit. By way of illustration, let's consider Zeke and Ted. We'll represent Zeke's assumptions about the interpretive context with this blue rectangle, and Ted's assumptions with this orange rectangle. Now suppose Zeke is thinking of this trunk, and he wants Ted to think of the same thing. Zeke has an idea of the state of Ted's thoughts, so based on what he wants to communicate and what he thinks Ted is thinking, he formulates a message that he thinks will lead Ted to infer the desired meaning. For Zeke's attempt at communication to be successful, however, not only does he have to make an accurate guess of what Ted's assumptions about the interpretive context are, but Ted in turn has to make an accurate guess of what Zeke's assumptions are. If both Zeke and Ted guess correctly, communication will be successful. If, however, Ted thinks Zeke is assuming something he is not, chances are he will attribute the wrong meaning to Zeke's message. Now suppose Zeke guesses wrong. Suppose he thinks Ted is assuming something that he is not. In this case, Zeke will formulate his message to fit what he believes Ted's thinking to be, but since Ted's understanding of the interpretive context is not what Zeke thought it was, he is likely to infer something that Zeke did not intend. Successful communication requires that the messenger and recipient each understand the essential elements about what the other believes about the context. In light of this, what does it mean that words have meaning? We'll continue exploring that question in the next video, part 4 of this series.